Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last session of CME Palooza, my favorite session of the day. Woo! And yes, a quick update. Phillies win 3-2. It just ended literally minutes ago, so they can rush and see the last session of
Yes,
CME Palooza.
that's right.
Definitely why. Okay, let me bring up the slides. This is our CME overview for the CME Professional session, or CME Basics, short name. Panelists today are Beth Brillinger, who's Global Medical Grants Manager for the fine company of Pfizer, and Eileen Katelmi. Did I say that right?
Yes, you did.
Pretty good.
Well done.
Director of Educational Development at the France Foundation. Before we go to them, of course, our sponsors. Gold sponsor, Academic CME. Silver sponsors, ASIM and Creative Educational Concepts, and Prova Education. And all of our bronze sponsors, Answers in CME, ACHL, Catalyst Medical Education, Catamount Medical Education, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, Global Academy for Medical Education, Global Education Group, Helio Education Lab, Integritas, Infograph Ed, Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, PCN, Primary Care Network, PVI, Red Med Ed, RMEI Medical Education, Thistle Editorial, and Vindico Medical Education. 3 ways to ask questions. For me, I'm reducing this to 2 ways to ask questions. One, you can use the ASIM text line to send in a question, 267-666-0CME. That one works great. You can click on the Google Slides link found on the live page. That one does not work great because for some reason I'm having trouble accessing it on my phone. So don't use that one. Tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. That one also works great. So texting and tweeting, best ways to get questions. I'll be monitoring both of those channels, and we'll monitor the questions that way. And then last slide before I turn it over to Eileen and Beth is our speaker disclosure, just letting you all know that if any opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are our own, and they do not represent an endorsement by or position of our employer, its parent company, or affiliates. And with that, I will turn it over to Beth and Eileen.
All right, thanks, Derek. I'll go on ahead and have you advance the slide here. So I kind of wanted to explain what the needs assessment was for deciding on this presentation. And, you know, you may ask yourself, how did we get into this mess or profession? And I'll just share my observation. You know, I had not attended the Alliance for Continuing Education in the Health Professions annual meeting for a few years. But I did in January of this year, and I noticed that there is always a need for an introduction to CME session. And so I thought that'd be a great option for CME Palooza. So I reached out to my friend Eileen to ask her if she wanted to present with me here at CME Palooza. What I noticed at the Alliance annual meeting was that there are always new faces and people who are just beginning to learn about what CME is. And very often those who find themselves in the continuing professional development profession find themselves there by accident. We all have our stories about how we arrived here, and we all had to navigate the abundant information available about what it is and what we focus on. Eileen, do you want to say a couple of things?
Yeah, no, Beth, I totally agree. The path is a long one, and often we're all coming from different origins, and that's what makes it a fun profession, frankly. And I think that there's a lot of perceptions about what we do, even amongst our own, our colleagues, certainly amongst, those that we work with and for. And so one of the things that Beth and I have talked about for this session too is to really start to help, if you're starting off on this journey, to think about the different roles that we play, and hopefully to give you some perspectives of the different, the different functions and kind of the importance of the work that we do. So that's another kind of thing that we wanted to share with you, so you can explain to your family and friends what truly important job that you do.
Yeah, so next slide, Derek. So this slide gives you a little information about where we're coming from. I've worn a few different hats. I've been working in this profession of CME for 20 plus years. I'm not going to count anymore at this point. So I kind of feel like, because I've done so many different aspects of this world, I can see an issue from various different points of view. But the overall lesson from the educational planning process for me is to always consider the spirit of the educational outcome and who it is that we're trying to help.
Yeah, I think that that's a good way to look at it, Beth. I mean, my history of different types of organizations within the CME provider community, the thing that strikes me is that it looks a little different depending on where your desk sits and your organizational type, if you're on the supporter side, if you're on the CME provider side. But the concepts and the goals of what we're doing prevail amongst them. And it might look a little different here or there, but the spirit of what we do, and often, the output and the processes that we use are very similar. So that's another thing that has kind of struck me as my career has moved forward.
Yeah, I totally agreed. And Derek, go on ahead and show us the next slide. So these are the learning objectives that Eileen and I put together in our needs assessment process. And what we decided to focus on was the planning process for physician education. While we were planning this presentation, we would both comment that it seemed like some of the specific concepts that we're going to cover, we could carve them out and do a whole separate hour-long presentation. So we're going to go through several different concepts on a very high level. We're going to focus on physician education, although we have both experienced that planning of educational programs for several different healthcare professionals. And of course, there will be several concepts that we will cover that are applicable to the planning process for many different types of healthcare professionals. You will hear us use a lot of acronyms. We are in a profession that loves to use those acronyms. These ideas may be new to you, and our presentation purposefully includes several links to resources at the end of the presentation. We'll go over them real quickly, but these are great places for you to go to explore these new ideas if you find that you need to. Derek, you can go on ahead and advance to the next slide. So I love this slide. This is Eileen's handiwork. This is a reminder that we're speaking from our own experience over the years and that our opinions are our own. We're also giving Derek the slide presentation to put up online on CME Palooza. I think this might be a valuable resource for other stakeholders and providers in our profession as well. And I joked with Eileen, if we see this slide with the minion on it, then we're going to be happy that somebody used our presentation. Yeah, go on ahead and advance to the next. It's always fun to be giving a presentation when my husband is texting me directions for tasks to tell my children to do. So that's fantastic. Yeah, so
awesome. Yeah, I fully expect my small children, which is why I know the minions very well, to come.
Yeah, we could see that too. Yeah, pets, children. Yep. But basically, I wanted to let you know before Eileen goes into this slide that our intention today is to provide a very general introduction to CME. You may know this acronym meaning continuing medical education, but it is also sort of synonymous with the acronym CPD. That stands for Continuing Professional Development. You may hear us use those acronyms interchangeably. And yes, we have geared our talk toward all provider types and stakeholders. So Eileen, I think, is going to dive into the life cycle of physician training.
Yeah. So we thought it would be helpful to really go back to the basics and talk a little bit about the world in which we work, and that is really founded in kind of servicing our learners. And so we thought it would be helpful to just give a brief overview of physician training and kind of this life cycle that our learners are in the midst of. So starting really with medical school, and then following that with residency. So when I started in CME, you know, I really didn't have a concept of training. So I think giving it the breadth and respect that it deserves here. At the end of residency, a physician becomes licensed, and that is the legal requirement to practice medicine within their state or any state that they are practicing in. And Beth, Derek, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add. I think telemedicine is kind of interesting in this licensing space because people are starting to practice across state borders. And so there's some attention that you might hear from learners or from your colleagues about that. But the main point here is that at the end of medical school and residency, that is when a physician becomes licensed and is able to practice as a doctor. Another concept you might hear is board certification. So this is something that at the end of residency, they may choose to do. It's not legally required to practice. There are many organizations that might require it of their employees. I think many physicians see this as a professional accomplishment that they choose to do. So they will become board certified or boarded in a particular kind of major specialty area. So whether it's internal medicine, pediatrics, surgery, radiology, those are different kind of big specialty areas that they will have chosen during their training, and then they become certified in that through an exam and then through continuing education as they maintain that. If they choose to specialize, they'll go into fellowship. And so that's, a period of time where they'll really become subspecialized. So that might be where they learn cardiology, endocrinology, all the different subspecialties of these major specialties. And so they will become certified in those as well, or may choose to. And then after that is lifelong learning, which is really where a lot of our work sits. But certainly many of you probably cross over and are working with fellows or trainees in your work as well. Depending on what type of organization you're in, you might be more closely working with those different levels of learners. And then the groups on the bottom, these are the regulatory groups. And Derek, you can go to the next slide. These are the groups that kind of have regulation over these different phases of training. So whether it's graduate medical education, continuing medical education, with the ACCME, and the state medical societies are part of that system as well, and the AMA, who owns the actual credit that we would put on CME activities. There is, I think, something worth noting with all of these groups is there's been a movement lately, I think, over the last 5 years or so, to really start to align these groups. So you see alignment in interprofessional continuing education. It started with the ACCME and the nursing credentialing, so those in charge of the nursing credits, the pharmacy credits, aligning the accreditation of CME providers or CPD providers. And so that is great for us. It makes our job easier if you have learners from these different groups. Your learners might not register this change, but it's certainly an alignment that helps on the production side of education. Another alignment is kind of licensure and certification, making sure that these physicians aren't having to, jump through hoops for all sorts of different people. So I think there's been movement there. And certainly in the certification space, there's been some boards that have really aligned with continuing medical education credit systems so that CME providers are able to put these different currencies, if you will, on the education that we produce. So we just wanted to kind of touch on some of these major groups and players, but I think the key takeaway here is the looking for these alignments, which make our job easier, and certainly, hopefully, the intent is to make the physicians' lives easier. Anything to add? We're good? All right.
No, perfect. Yep.
All right.
I'm with you.
Good deal. Good deal. So, one of the things Beth and I were talking about is continuing ed, that there is this kind of requirement piece of it. And I think that that's, when I talked earlier about a perspective of your role, some people do have the perspective of the CME police, or, bean counters and paper pushers and things like that. And I think that that's where this kind of regulatory feel of the work that we do as being required of these different groups. But I think the more compelling motivation for our learners is really their drive to be professionals and to keep on the top of their game for their patients, for their colleagues. And so we really do fulfill this need that they have to stay current, to stay at the top of their game, to learn best practices from each other, to learn the latest literature, the latest research, all of that. So we're part of that system, and that's personally the system that I like to think about being a part of. And then the currency is kind of a value add that we're able to give to the activities. Next slide. So this is this idea of currencies, right? We plan our activities in a certain way, and we can then assign currencies, this educational value for learners, if we're following certain rules and processes. So the American Medical Association owns the credit that accredited providers, CME providers, put on activities for physicians. So there's two different types of credits. The Category 1 credit is the type that we would put on an activity, and the physicians then self-report that or report that to the AMA or to their hospital or now to certifying boards. They'll use this currency to prove that they're keeping up in their education. There's also a Category 2 credit, which a physician can apply directly to the AMA and use that. So there are different activities. We've included a link to there's a booklet produced by the AMA PRA department. And so that can be helpful. But again, there's been in recent years a lot of alignment between the ACCME and the AMA. So the owners of the credit and then the accrediting body. And so that's been really helpful as we do our work to make things simpler. And then the MOC points is another type of currency that continuing ed providers might add to their activities if they plan them in a certain way to meet those requirements. So again, a lot of information out there on the web, and we've included some URLs at the end, some resources that we'll talk through if you want to learn more about those. But I think this idea of currency is a good one. That's fine. So a day in the life of the lifelong learner. I think here, what you'll notice when you start to get into this industry is really the breadth and depth of the work that's being done locally and nationally. And so for your learners, they're seeing CME in their inbox. They're seeing CME posted on bulletin boards at work. They're going to national conferences with their major association where they're members. So there's continuing ed in all sorts of different places, in all sorts of different formats, from free to expensive. And so there's a big variety for them to choose from. I think, the things that they're considering: cost, credibility, convenience, learning preferences. Those are the types of things that are driving them. To content, some challenges that they have, I think we hear, they're tracking their engagement. If you can imagine having to keep track of all of this currency you're earning, and there's really no centralized bank, or there's a few banks that, there's an LMS over here, there's a learning management system over here, and then you have certificates in a folder over here. It can be very challenging. And that's, it seems so, I don't know, like such a simple thing, but I think it proves to be kind of a headache for people. And on the CME provider side, you probably spend a lot of time tracking and helping keep track of things and facilitating that process. Yeah, you can go ahead. So here, this is data from the ACCME. And every year they will produce an annual report. And some of you are probably already familiar with the program. What does PARS stand for? Program and Activity Reporting System.
It sounds familiar.
Right.
It's been a little while, but not too long. It's been a little while.
Yeah.
Sounds right.
Yeah, so yearly, sometimes this is a proactive process where you're entering your activities. For instance, if you're approving them for MOC, you're putting them into the system so that you can then track engagement of your learners. Sometimes it's retrospective, so you're looking back at the previous year and putting in your activities into the system. And from that, the ACCME is able to produce an annual report that really talks to the breadth and depth of the CME enterprise within the United States. And it includes both nationally accredited organizations that are accredited directly from the ACCME, and also those that are more locally based. So they might be accredited by their state medical society. But this gives you a sense of the size and scope of the work that we do, the number of accredited providers, the number of activities, and the, staggering number of educational interventions that this system is producing every year. And it really does highlight the different types of providers that you might see and you might encounter if you go to a meeting like the Alliance meeting or ACCME meeting, as well as the variety of formats and different approaches that your colleagues are taking in delivering education. So before we move on, Beth, anything like big picture that you think we didn't touch on here? It's a lot.
Yeah. I think that was our biggest challenge in creating this presentation, was to try and find something that would benefit all types of providers and stakeholders. And we tried to kind of have in mind who might be listening or watching at a later time. And the fact is, one size does not fit all. There might be information that's not necessarily important. Scale of programs can be very different. Perspectives can be very different. But that's our goal, is to try and meet the needs of any new CME professional that's just trying to get a basic understanding of what they're jumping into.
Yeah. Well, and I think sometimes, when I often find, you go to meetings or CME Palooza and you're listening to people's examples of the different things that they do. And as adult learners, we're always trying to figure out, right, how do we apply this to what we do? And I think that what Beth and I are hoping to do is to give you a sense of kind of the big picture, and that there's many different ways to go about what we do, depending on where, what type of organization you're in, what the activity or the needs are of a particular project that you're working on, what your resources are. I think that all of those go into play, but rest assured there's a lot of flexibility and room to be creative in that.
Yeah, I wonder if you find this. One thing that I notice now, just in preparing for this presentation, is that when I started in this 20 years ago, there were not a lot of educational resources about what the responsibilities were for an accredited provider. And I remember somebody handing me a book. It was blue and it was called A CME Primer. I don't know if you ever saw that book or not. That was about it.
I had it.
Yeah. You might have. But now, and we will share all these links at the end of this presentation, and they'll certainly be preserved on the slide deck that Derek's going to post. But Oh my goodness, the ACCME and other accrediting bodies have really done a great job in pulling together tutorials, videos, flow charts, examples, troubleshooting. I'm really happy to be able to kind of compile this information for the new CME professional to help them in their journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, so let's talk about, we can move on. We're gonna talk a little bit about making the magic. So really starting to look a little bit specifically at how we do what we do. Next slide. So I think this concept is core and often oddly causes confusion. This idea of a CE or a CME program versus an activity. And I think it's just a matter of people using the same word to mean two different things. When we're talking about it here in this context, certainly in the requirements of the ACCME, your program includes all of the things. So the resources that you have, the staff, the volunteers, your building, your governance, all of that, all the processes that you have in administering that program, and then the activities themselves. And those activities are the educational interventions. So yeah, go ahead, Derek. So I think it's helpful when you think about it that way, because some of the requirements and some of the processes you may look around and see where, at your organization, some of them are really focused on that organizational, that CE program level. And some of them are focused on the activity level. And I think that it's important to educate yourself and to understand which things, and I say requirements, but you also might be just seeing it in the work that you do. Which are the things that we should do with each activity or sets of activities? And which are the things that are more strategic or bigger picture that might be more about our program? And so that's kind of an important concept to take away, I think. Very basic, but kind of fundamental to what we do. So this plan, do, study, act model that you see, the requirements for your CME program are structured along this model. And so you'll hear about this model, potentially with your learners and with work that you're doing. It also applies to your CME or CE program. And so the requirements, you must have a mission statement with expected results. So that's your plan. You do the activities. So you have all sorts of processes, and there's a ton of requirements, which we'll go into, and steps in the process of producing those activities. The study part is you as a CE provider are asked to reflect on your program periodically. There is no specification. This is very much up to your organization and the resources they have and how you want to approach it as far as how often this happens, who does it, what you're looking at in totality. But you are expected to reflect back on your mission. And then the act part is making improvements. So looking at yourself and making improvements. Probably something that you're already doing, this process for your CME program. I know I think we're a reflective bunch, but just wanted to kind of link that for you when you think about these requirements and your program overall. Derek, you can advance. We're not talking about the accreditation with commendation criteria, which have recently undergone a shift at the ACCME. Not so much in joint accreditation yet, though I think that's the movement, and I'm by no means an expert in that. But those commendation criteria, some of them are, again, you're going to see in the activities, and some of them you're going to see in this big programmatic spirit. But there are, as Beth said, a lot of resources for that on the ACCME website and with your colleagues.
Am I on the wrong slide?
No, because you're just cueing me.
Okay.
You're good.
Okay.
You're good. So part of the work that we do in delivering the activities is tied up in a set of guiding principles from the ACCME called the Standards for Commercial Support. And so I'm going to turn things over to Beth to give an kind of high-level overview of these. These are an important set of requirements to be aware of from a CME provider perspective. So we wanted to spend a few minutes talking through them.
Yeah, and you know what? I hate to do this to you, Derek, but could you just go back to the last slide real quick? I really like how Eileen kind of indicated on this plan, do, study, act slide. You'll see the notifications that she put in there that are, the letter C and some numbers, so C2 to C11, C12, et cetera. And that's shorthand for the criteria in the ACCME accreditation rulebook. And that gives you a little idea of what each of those criteria are aligning with in the planning process. So go on ahead and skip forward. That SCS acronym that you also saw on that previous slide is our little shorthand, our acronym for the Standards for Commercial Support. And this is the language that we use when we talk about these things. We just talk about SCS number, whatever, and there's the several different numbers involved with that. A couple of important concepts and requirements of program planning and ensuring that CME is independent, and ensuring that the content is validated for scientific accuracy. There are several ways for providers to validate content for scientific accuracy. There are great resources for exploring these methods listed at the end of the presentation. But I'm going to shift a little bit away from scientific accuracy and just focus on the Standards for Commercial Support. These series of compliance rules are crucial to making sure that educational content is independent of influence from a commercial interest. The ACCME definition of a commercial interest is any entity producing, marketing, reselling, or distributing healthcare goods or services consumed by or used on patients. There's more to the definition, but that's the gist of it. In the ACCME annual report, I've noticed a lot over the years, some of the most commonly missed requirements among the accreditation criteria are those related to the Standards for Commercial Support. The Standards for Commercial Support document itself has become a pillar document for other accreditors. You'll see some of the accrediting bodies for other healthcare professions use the Standards for Commercial Support. So depending on your range of learners, the professionals that you're teaching, it is an important document to be aware of. Providers, need to understand not only the rules, but the spirit of the standards. So let's go over a few of these standards briefly. Next slide. So this is the first one, SCS1, Standards for Commercial Support number 1, and that focuses on independence from commercial interest. So in this standard, the CME provider must be independent of the commercial supporter or commercial interest, if there is one or more. Not all CME activities are supported by commercial interests, but if there is a commercial interest providing any kind of support, the spirit of this rule is that a provider must remain free of any control from that supporter or supporters. Some examples spelled out in the standard are the planning decisions related to identifying the educational needs of the activity audience, the presentation of content, selection of anyone in control of the content of the activity, selection of educational methods, and evaluation of the activity. I think it's also important to point out that the commercial interest concept not only applies to the organization or company, but also applies to the employees of a commercial interest. There are additional considerations covered in the Standards for Commercial Support about employees of a commercial interest. And if your provider organization needs to understand those considerations, I would suggest that you reach out to the ACCME directly for tutorials and explanations. And that's really true for any concept. I have always found that the ACCME is extremely interested in making sure that providers understand concepts. I am no longer on the provider side, and I have probably reached out to a former colleague of mine that's at the ACCME 3 times with compliance questions just to make sure that I am doing the right thing from my perspective.
Yeah, I think that's right, Beth. And you know, things like this with the standard 1, you know, whether it's dealing with companies that are supporting activities that you're producing, if it's, you know, any commercial interest, right? They might not be providing support for the actual activity. There's still this necessary independence from their control of the decisions that you are making about the content, about who is talking, all of that. So that's really this spirit. And then the sense of that there might be employees who have information to share. The ACCME has certain scenarios where that is acceptable, and a lot of information on their website. And I agree, like they contact us, and reaching out to them is extremely helpful, and is independent of your accreditation process. So it is it's kind of set up in a very fair way. So you should trust and feel safe and going to them as colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead to the next slide, Derek. So standard for commercial support 2, it deals with personal conflicts of interest. So everyone involved in developing or delivering content must disclose all relevant financial relationships with any commercial interest to the provider. So let's break that down a little bit. That means the speaker, yes, but it also means anyone else involved in creating the content. That could mean a peer reviewer, a medical writer, or even a CME coordinator who may edit the learning objectives to make sure that they are measurable. The provider must in some way collect the disclosures. Oftentimes it's a form. It doesn't have to be a form, but these disclosures need to be collected. Provider identifies if there is information to disclose, as well as if there is no information to disclose. So what I mean by that is that if there is no information to disclose, the provider must make sure that that information is communicated to the audience prior to the start of the activity. You may see this in a statement such as, Dr. Jones has nothing to disclose. If there is a relevant financial relationship to disclose, that information must also be communicated to the audience prior to the start of the activity. And Eileen had the great idea of actually putting a link to the ACCME's resource of a flow chart for resolving conflicts of interest on this slide. It's also in the end of the slide deck as well. It can be a complicated process. And if the provider determines that there is a relevant financial relationship that needs to be, you know, possibly could be a conflict of interest and needs to be resolved, then there's this process that provider can go through to mitigate, to resolve that conflict of interest. I think that the most important part of this really cool flow chart that the ACCME provides is the very key piece of information that this process should start very early in the planning stages of the activity, because sometimes this can take some time. You may find that you can't resolve a potential conflict of interest, and you may need to shift your plans for your activity so that that individual who may have an unresolvable conflict cannot be involved in presenting content for the activity. But that's not the goal. The goal is to try and address this early, go through the process, and resolve those conflicts of interest. Yeah, you can go on ahead to the next slide. Or Eileen, did you have any comments about that?
No, I mean, I think it is, you know, get the information, look at it. If something appears to cause a conflict, do something about it. And then moving on, tell the learners, disclose this information to the learners in the spirit of transparency. Like it's that, the concepts of the standard 2 and standard 6 are simple. The mechanics of doing it can be complicated. Nuanced. So it is something that you'll probably have a lot of processes about, a lot of angst and all of this, and rightfully so. It's a really important job. I think there's ways to do it efficiently and dare I say creatively. You know, you don't need a form, those types of things, but it's an area that you'll probably spend a good amount of time in, and again, lots of resources.
Right, and the next slide is making sure we disclose to the learner. I think, Eileen, isn't this the one that gets people in trouble on the annual report? Isn't this?
Yeah, I think SCS2 is probably the trickiest.
Right.
One sometimes will trip people up.
Yeah. So it's important in the spirit of disclosure to provide that clear information to the learners. This is kind of a funny slide, but basically, it can seem pretty simple and rudimentary, but if you have 5 staff members in your office of CME and they're involved in creating or, fine-tuning the content, their disclosures need to be included as well. And you can say a blanket statement and, have collected the disclosures from those 5 folks and just say the office of CME has nothing to disclose, and bam, you've made your disclosure to your learners prior to the start of the activity. It can be as simple as that. All right, Derek, why don't you go on ahead? So in this slide, there's a few different standards for commercial support, or SCSs. They should be explored. Each provider must have a process to address the appropriate use of commercial support, how and where promotional materials may be appropriately displayed, and ensuring that the content and format of educational activities is free of commercial bias. All providers should be well-versed in the SCS, Standards for Commercial Support. For me, that document was probably the one that I referred to the most often. I'd actually printed out the Standards for Commercial Support and had it in the drawer next to me. I would use it repeatedly to explain to colleagues how and why certain decisions must be made. And the idea that I would turn to ultimately, if I didn't have a specific rule, was that whole spirit of the standards. And there's kind of an interesting situation I ran across, and probably now 19 years ago, but in one case I was asked why the educational materials for a CME educational initiative could not be created in the exact same color palette as the newly approved drug of the commercial supporter for those educational activities. I was asked to show me the rule that explained why the exact same colors for the drug could not be used for the educational activity. Well, there was no rule that said that, but I did explain that the perception of a lack of independence, if the colors were exactly the same, was not something that we wanted to try and deal with. And the spirit of the standards that applied to the situation kind of dictated to us that it was a bad idea. Sometimes I found that the toughest critics of these rules can be our own colleagues. So let's get back to the ACCME aligned requirements to the model of Plan, Do, Study, Act. Next slide. We shift our focus to the process of designing impactful activities. So these planning stages focus on several ACCME criteria. You can go on ahead to the next slide, Derek. And that's criteria 2, 3, 5, and ultimately 11 for those of you playing along at home with your list of accreditation criteria. I'd suggest definitely sitting down and reading the individual criteria to provide background. Specifically for criterion 2, you'll look to discover who you're trying to help and what is the problem you're trying to solve. How have you discovered that there is a problem, and what might be the reason for the problem? That's how you'll determine the educational needs and the practice gaps that you're trying to impact. I think of it as narrowing the practice gaps. We can't always close them, but narrowing them is an important step. Keywords that you will consider when determining the needs related to criterion 2 are knowledge, competence, or performance. The next step in planning is taking what is learned through the identification of the educational need and deciding how you can make it better. This relates to criterion 3. How can you narrow or even close that practice gap when you see in learners? How can you translate that effort to the improvement of either knowledge, competence, or performance, or even 2 or 3 of those options? And once you've determined these ideas, what formats will you choose to successfully address the desired results of the activities? Do you have anything to add, Eileen?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that this comes down, I'm a simple gal. And for me, when I think about these requirements, and if you're talking to other people, you know, forget it if you use criterion 2 and forget it if you use, you know, professional practice gaps and sadly educational needs. Like sometimes what's the problem? Like tell me, explain to me. You know, earlier in our presentation, I think we had, I help experts organize their expertise so they can teach it to others. It's that process, right? And the core of educational planning boils down to really facilitating that discovery of what is it that the experts or your content folks know that you can help them kind of break down and put together. And so I think simple questions can sometimes be very effective.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that just takes it down to basics, and that's what makes sense. And if you're going to meet with somebody in one of your departments in your university hospital or a small local hospital or whatnot, and you're just trying to give them, okay, lay out the framework for how to plan these activities. That's the most basic way to look at it. And it's not so easy to try and explain all these criteria and explain what exactly they mean. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago when I gave a presentation on CME Palooza about a specific planning document that actually aligned itself with some of that very basic accreditation criteria. I identified what sections of the planning document matched what criteria, and I knew that, but the people who were filling out the planning document, they didn't need to know all that. It was asking some very basic questions about the need and the practice gap and the desired result and that kind of thing. But it was really great whenever those particular activities were pulled for, the performance and practice part of the reaccreditation self-study to be able to say, okay, this is where criterion 2 came from. This is where criterion 3 came from, because it was laid out really carefully in the plan.
Right.
So, you guys could search the CME Palooza archives if you're interested in hearing more about that.
I believe that was actually 5 years ago, Beth.
Stop it!
5 years ago. I think it was the very first one we did.
Get out of town. Oh my gosh. Okay, fine. On that note, let's go on ahead and move forward. So criterion 5 addresses activity formats. I'm going to go through this slide really quickly. There's a whole bunch of different activity formats that might be appropriate for the setting objectives and desired results of the activity. And here are just some of them. The pretty cool thing that I'm seeing these days is that new ideas are popping up every day. Gamification. I can't even begin to add to this list because there's so many new things I'm seeing that are actually pretty exciting. And exciting for the adult learner as well. The design tactics, what are the best ways to analyze the changes in learner knowledge, competence, or performance? Here's some great ideas. What changes do we expect learners to make? What changes do the learners actually make? And how does that impact patients? Which leads us to criterion 11. So next slide. So you see that additional line down there on the bottom. How will we know if we've been successful? And that leads us to the whole idea of educational outcomes measurement. And Eileen is going to tackle that idea.
Yeah, it's something, I mean, if today's CME Palooza sessions, right, or any indication, outcomes is a really important topic to our community of professionals. It's being refined and tackled in a lot of different ways and by a lot of very, very smart people. And so we want to touch on just some basic concepts as you think about it, as you start off in this journey, and to give you some context in learning about it, about how you're measuring the success of the activities. Criterion 11, there is a requirement that you are measuring for learner change, Not that you're making learner change, but that you have a mechanism that measures for change in what somebody is prepared to do or what they do. So competence or performance, or even at the patient level, so the patient outcomes. But that's the requirement, right? What's really important is, and thank you, Derek, is you're measuring success for a bunch of different reasons, right? You're going to have different stakeholders, whether it's commercial supporters, whether it's your leadership within your organization, whether it's your learners themselves. There's all sorts of different folks that are interested in whether your education is successful. And when we talk about learners wanting, the most bang for their time buck, right? Show them that it makes a difference to engage in your education. That's a huge plus. So there are different ways that we would look at success in activities, and you can think about them almost in two buckets. You've got activity level kind of evaluation. So did you deliver what you plan to deliver? And this is where you might see, did you hit your registration numbers? Did you exceed them? What was the perception from your learners about the quality of the faculty, the quality of, hopefully not the food, right? We get a lot of that, but things like, were you on track with your budget, your timing, like all of those things that are activity level. And then you want to think about outcomes. This is really what was the impact of the activity. So did you make a difference in your learners? So it might be in their knowledge. What do they know now that they didn't know? What are they prepared to do in practice when they head back out into the world with their patients or with colleagues, if they're a researcher, their research skills. And then did you make an impact? Did your activities make an impact on patient outcomes or public health? Now, you don't have to do that, but those are different levels of outcomes that you might look to study when you think about your activities. Next slide. This is a quote from Don Moore, and if you've been listening in, we've heard a lot about him today on CME Palooza. You've certainly probably come across the name, but it really does, I think, exemplify at its core the value statement that we're looking to make as a community. Next slide. So Moore's model, I'm sorry, my dog is like at the door. I told you, Beth.
You made it pretty far without it.
I know. So Moore's model starts at the most basic with participation. So did people come and were they there? And then it moves up into these different tiers. So were they satisfied? Did they like the education? Did they learn something? So this might be your knowledge level. What did they know? What do they know how to do? So this kind of graduated level up into even community health. Next slide. There are many, many ways to measure for all of these different levels. And as we've heard today, and kind of a theme within the community is absolutely, there's a lot of room for standardization and kind of keeping this together. Hi, Scott. I think Scott is our warning there.
I apologize for that.
No. So I think what's important here is there's a lot of different options that you have as you design your activities to think about how to measure the outcomes and what you're shooting for. And not everything can be at the public health, community health level. And that is absolutely okay from many different stakeholders. The gold star is from a CME compliance perspective. You are expected to kind of measure for that competence, whether they have strategies walking out of your education that they can put into practice. So that's kind of that lowest bar from a accreditation perspective. But there's a variety of tools that you can use to achieve those different levels. So one of those is commitment to change. I think, I don't know, Beth, unless you feel strongly, I think that if the slides are available after for this, it talks about one approach that you can use with activities that allows people to kind of make a commitment to a change that they'll do after your activity. It's important in two ways, and this would be the only thing I'll say about it. is it is a measurement tool for you as kind of outcomes, right? What are people articulating as a change that they plan to make, and how committed are they? That tells you a lot of really valuable information about your learners, but it does something really valuable for your learners. And I think that when you think about outcomes measurement and tools, that's the perspective that I like to take, is how can I design education that is for the learner and then learn from that? And so a commitment to change actually predisposes people to being committed to making a change, right? There's a reason it's called that. And that's an important kind of thought process that they go through when they go through an exercise like this. So it might be a design component that serves your learners first and allows you some really rich outcomes. And I think that that's always the sweet spot that I look for when thinking about how to measure outcomes. So we'll have this, this kind of idea of a tool that you can use, this commitment to change tool, within the slide deck on CME Palooza. But I don't think we need to go into it in the interest of time. So I think we could probably move forward the resources and kind of wrap up.
Yeah, sure. So resources to explore. As promised, you can go ahead to the next slide. There are several different links here, and I agree that perhaps we shouldn't spend too much time on some of these. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Derek. So this is, let's see, glossary of terms. Well, we've got our own vernacular. That's an important one to take a look at. The ACCME Compliance Library. I will tell you that this is one of the resources that I used all the time as well, as far as when it came to planning and writing the self-study, and also just basically planning the general program at accredited providers where I worked. Because the ACCME Compliance Library is very easy to search, and they give you compliance examples for each accreditation criteria, each standard for commercial support, that basically gives you good examples of how things were done right and bad examples of how things were not compliant. Really helped me to nail down some of the important aspects of the programs that I was working on. Let's see, next slide. See what I want to point out here. AMA PRA booklet, man, I had that printed out and dog-eared and in a drawer next to me as well. And it's funny, as many times as I've seen the designation statement, I feel like I have it memorized, but it was always nice to have it there to check and double check the words were correct. There's that additional link, ACCME resources for validating scientific accuracy. Do I have one more slide? Yes. I think that the two things that I wanted to talk about with this slide is I kind of wanted to give a little bit of a plug for the ACCME. Once I had been in the CME profession for a few years and had some experience under my belt, I applied to become a surveyor for the ACCME, a volunteer surveyor. I completely recommend this to anybody that so desires to do this. You learn so much. You learn more specific examples and aspects of each accreditation requirement, including accreditation with commendation. And you get to see sort of behind the curtain for other providers' programs when you are a surveyor for them. And it is a fascinating experience, probably one of the most valuable experiences I've had in CME. So I definitely recommend, if you so desire at some point in the future, go on ahead and reach out to the ACCME and find out the process involved in volunteering as a surveyor. And then, that last bullet I kind of just threw on a couple of days ago, but I do remember Bloom's taxonomy as a great place to kind of give me some better ideas for writing better learning objectives. And there's a lot of different resources. Use your favorite search engine to look up Bloom's taxonomy. Something else that I printed out and tacked onto my bulletin board, and I'd be able to, all right, what's a better verb to use for that learning objective? Next slide. And this brings us back to our learning objectives. And here we are, I think, with, I don't know, seconds to spare. But these were our intentions to present to you today and provide you with some background and high-level information for the new CME Professional. And I wonder if there are any questions.
There were a couple, but you pretty much covered them all.
Nice.
With everything you had. Well, before I move on, Eileen, any final words before I wrap things up?
No, but thank you.
Great. Thank you both. That was a wonderful and a wonderfully thorough overview, which I think is going to be a great resource for a lot of people. We've already had a couple tweets about it already, so that'll be great. Thank you both very much. There was a little bit of a Beth did mention that presentation. It was from the very first CME Palooza, so we're 5 years later, so sort of an anniversary presentation from Beth as well. Thank you for that. Let me do my one last slide here before we can totally wrap it up. So one last plug. If you haven't already done it, please take our survey. We do use that information quite a bit, especially your topic suggestions is pretty valuable information for us. So there's a link right on the live page that you can go to it. It's only 7 questions. If it takes more than a minute, Scott will come over to your house and bake you a pie or something like that. Other than that,
Derek, is it going to be up for a while on the?
What's that?
Is it going to be up for a while on the page?
Oh yeah, we'll be up there now. We'll send out another reminder to people probably tomorrow or sometime.
Cool.
Thank you all for watching our latest CME Palooza 5-year anniversary. Had lots of people, lots of nice interaction. Scott, you have any final words you want to share?
I'm disappointed because Derek and I have been secretly practicing to do a duet of "You're the One That I Want." And Derek's is a really good Olivia Newton-John, but unfortunately we're out of time, so we'll have to save it for the fall.
Maybe next time, maybe for the fall. What's that? Do you remember the date for the fall?
October, the middle Wednesday in October. I don't remember the date off the top of my head.
I'll make sure I schedule my jury duty for October. For all of you who asked if that was a true story that I wrote on the blog, yes, it was a true story. I scheduled my jury duty for today and then forgot about it until yesterday afternoon when I got an email saying I didn't have to come. So it all worked out.
It was just meant to be.
It was meant to be. On that note, I think that's it for us. Thank you all. Have a nice evening, and we'll see you next October.
Thanks, guys.